Hey everyone, tonight we're diving into something that keeps archaeologists awake at night, something written in clay 5,000 years ago that suggests human civilization might be far older and far stranger than we've been taught. So before we begin this journey into the deep past, take a moment to like this video and subscribe if you enjoy these explorations into history's greatest mysteries. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now settle in, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that gentle background hum, and let's ease into tonight's investigation together. We're heading to southern Iraq, to the desert where the first cities rose from the mud, where writing was born, where priests kept records that would survive millennia. But these records tell a story that doesn't quite fit. They speak of kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years. They describe cities that existed before the flood, before history itself, and buried within these ancient texts is a pattern, a numerical signature that some researchers believe points to something extraordinary. 7 civilizations rose and fell before Sumer, each leaving traces in the archaeological record, each remembered in myth and legend, each contributing to the sudden explosive emergence of what we call the first civilization. But perhaps Sumer wasn't first at all. In the spring of 1922, British archaeologist Leonard Woolley stood in the Mesopotamian desert, staring at a clay tablet that had just been extracted from the ruins of the ancient city of Ur. The cuneiform script was clear enough, the wedge-shaped marks pressed into the clay some 4,000 years ago by a Sumerian scribe. But what the tablet said made no sense according to conventional history. It listed kings, rulers of cities that supposedly existed before a great flood swept across the land, and these kings, according to the tablet, didn't reign for years or even decades. They ruled for 28,800 years, for 36,000 years, for 43,200 years. Woolley wasn't looking at history as we understood it. He was looking at something else entirely, something that would take nearly a century to begin to understand. The tablet he held was a copy of the Sumerian king list, one of the most important and most perplexing documents ever recovered from the ancient world. The Sumerian king list exists in multiple copies found at various archaeological sites across ancient Mesopotamia. The most complete version, inscribed on the clay prism now housed in the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, was discovered in the 1920s. This particular prism, known as the Weld-Blundell prism, stands about 8 inches tall and contains 4 sides, each inscribed with 2 columns of cuneiform text. It was created around 2000 BCE during the reign of the Isin dynasty, but the information it contains reaches back much, much further. The text begins with a phrase that has echoed through the millennia. After the kingship descended from heaven, the kingship was in Eridu. This opening line establishes something fundamental to Sumerian cosmology. Kingship, the right to rule, didn't emerge from human society. It came from above, from the realm of the gods, and it descended to earth at a specific location, the city of Eridu. Modern archaeology confirms that Eridu was indeed one of the oldest, if not the oldest, city in southern Mesopotamia, with occupation layers dating back to at least 5,400 BCE. But the king list goes further, much further back into a misty past that blurs the line between history and mythology. What follows that opening declaration is a list of 8 kings who ruled 5 different cities before the flood. The first king, Alulim, ruled in Eridu for 28,800 years. The second, Al-Aljar, ruled for 36,000 years, also in Eridu. The pattern continues through Bad Tabira, Larak, Sippar, and Shurapak, each city hosting kings with impossibly long reigns. The total span of these antediluvian rulers adds up to 241,200 years of kingship before the flood came. Then the list makes a stark declaration. Then the flood swept over. After that cataclysmic event, kingship descended from heaven once more, this time to the city of Kish, and the reign lengths suddenly become more realistic, though still extraordinary by modern standards. Post-flood kings ruled for hundreds of years rather than tens of thousands, and as the list progresses toward historical times, the numbers gradually decrease to more human lifespans. For over a century, scholars have debated what to make of these enormous numbers. The easy dismissal is to call them purely mythological, invented to give antiquity and prestige to the institution of kingship. But that explanation doesn't account for the precision of the numbers or the consistent mathematical patterns they display. The antediluvian reign lengths aren't random. They're based on a sophisticated sexagesimal system, the same base 60 mathematics that the Sumerians used for astronomy and timekeeping, the same system that gives us 60 seconds in a minute and 360 degrees in a circle. When analysed mathematically, the reign lengths reveal something interesting. They're expressed in units called sars, which equal 3,600 years, ners, which equal 600 years, and sosses, which equal 60 years. These aren't arbitrary numbers. They're systematic, calculated, deliberately chosen. Some researchers have suggested that these numbers might be symbolic, representing something other than literal years, perhaps celestial cycles, astronomical periods, or ritual time rather than historical time. But others have noted that if you apply certain conversion formulas, taking into account different calendrical systems, or the possibility that the scribes were recording something entirely different than what we assume, the numbers start to align with geological timescales, with the periods between major climate events, with the spans of time suggested by archaeology for the development of agriculture, metallurgy, and urban civilization. The question becomes, what were the Sumerians actually recording? Were these kings real rulers whose reign lengths were exaggerated for theological purposes? Were they gods or demigods, celestial beings whose existence operated on a different temporal scale? Or were they something else, perhaps the personification of entire civilizational periods, each king representing not an individual but an era, a cultural phase, a distinct civilization that rose, flourished, and eventually fell? Here's where things get really interesting. The king list mentions 5 antediluvian cities: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. Archaeological excavation has confirmed the existence of all these sites. They're real places, ancient settlements that do indeed date to the earliest periods of Mesopotamian civilization. But the list specifically states there were 8 kings ruling these 5 cities before the flood. Not 7, not 9, but 8. This number appears significant in Sumerian cosmology. 8 appears repeatedly in their religious texts as a number of completion, of fullness, of cosmic order. 8 gods formed the first divine assembly. 8 gates guarded the underworld. 8 winds were known to the ancient astronomers. And now, hidden within the structure of the king list itself, researchers have identified another pattern, one that involves the number 7. If you remove the first and last antediluvian kings, focusing on the middle 6, and analyse the cities they ruled, the mathematical relationships between their reign lengths, and the archaeological evidence from these sites, a structure emerges. This structure suggests that before the civilization we call Sumer, before Eridu rose as the first city, there were 7 distinct cultural horizons, 7 previous attempts at complex society, each building on the knowledge of its predecessor, each leaving traces in the archaeological record that we're only now beginning to properly recognize and interpret. This is where conventional archaeology starts to feel incomplete. We know that the Ubaid culture predated classical Sumer. We know that the Ubaidians built the first temples, developed irrigation agriculture, created distinctive pottery, and established trading networks that stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. The Ubaid period lasted from roughly 6,500 BCE to 3,800 BCE, nearly 3,000 years of cultural development. But recent excavations have revealed that the Ubaid culture itself wasn't monolithic. It went through distinct phases, each marked by changes in pottery styles, architectural techniques, settlement patterns, and apparent social organization. Some archaeologists now recognize at least 7 distinct Ubaid phases, each representing several centuries of development. And beneath the Ubaid layers, in the very earliest occupation levels of sites like Eridu and Tel el Awali, there are hints of even earlier settlement, traces of cultures we know almost nothing about because their remains are buried under meters of later occupation. The deeper archaeologists dig, the older civilization becomes. Every decade pushes the date of first settlement back further into the past. In the 1920s, Sumer was thought to begin around 3000 BCE. By the 1950s, the Ubaid period had been recognized, pushing civilization back to 4000 BCE. The 1980s brought discoveries that extended occupation to 5000 BCE. Now, in the 21st century, we have solid archaeological evidence of complex society in southern Mesopotamia, dating to 6500 BCE, and tantalizing hints of occupation going back even further, perhaps to 7000 or even 8000 BCE. But here's what keeps researchers up at night. The earliest levels of occupation at Eridu, the levels dating to around 5400 BCE, don't show a primitive, struggling settlement gradually learning how to farm and build. They show a sophisticated culture with advanced architectural knowledge, complex irrigation systems, and a fully developed religious tradition centered on the god Enki. The first temple at Eridu, discovered in the lowest archaeological levels, is small but perfectly formed, with all the architectural elements that would characterize Mesopotamian sacred architecture for the next 3000 years. It's as if the builders already knew exactly what they were doing, as if they were following a template, working from a knowledge base that was already well established. This is the phenomenon that archaeologists call the Sumerian problem. Sumerian civilization appears in the archaeological records suddenly, explosively, already sophisticated. The conventional explanation is that the development happened somewhere else, perhaps in a region that's now underwater due to rising sea levels at the end of the last ice age, and that this fully formed culture then migrated to southern Mesopotamia, bringing their knowledge with them. The Persian Gulf has risen significantly since 8000 BCE. The coastline in Sumerian times was much further south than it is today, and vast areas that were once dry land are now beneath hundreds of feet of water. If there were settlements in those regions, settlements that might have been the true birthplace of civilization, we'll never find them without underwater archaeology in one of the most politically unstable and difficult to access regions on Earth. The Sumerian texts themselves provide some intriguing hints about this possibility. In multiple creation myths and cosmological texts, the Sumerians spoke of Dilmun, a paradisiacal land to the south and east, a place associated with the dawn of civilization, with divine knowledge, with the origins of agriculture and writing and kingship. For a long time, scholars identified Dilmun with the island of Bahrain in the Persian Gulf. And archaeological work there has indeed revealed evidence of ancient Mesopotamian contact and influence. But some researchers now suggest that the original Dilmun, the mythical Dilmun of the earliest texts, might refer to a much larger region now submerged that once connected the Arabian Peninsula to Iran, creating a vast lowland plain where the first experiments in agriculture and urban living might have taken place. If this is true, if the cradle of civilization is now underwater, then the archaeological record we're working with is fundamentally incomplete. We're looking at the final chapter of a much longer story. We're seeing the survivors, the refugees, the inheritors of knowledge developed elsewhere, in a drowned land whose name is preserved only in myth. This brings us to the core question that drives the seventh civilization hypothesis. What if the antediluvian section of the Sumerian king list isn't describing individual rulers at all, but rather chronicling 7 distinct civilizational phases, 7 cultural horizons that preceded classical Sumer? What if each king represents not a person but an entire cultural period, a specific developmental stage in the long, slow climb toward urban civilization? This interpretation actually makes the enormous reign lengths make sense. If Alulim's 28,800-year reign in Eridu represents not a single ruler but an entire cultural epoch, a long period during which a particular way of life, a particular social organization, a particular relationship between humans and the divine predominated in the region, then the number is no longer absurd. It becomes a chronological marker, a way of organizing deep time, of dividing the long prehistoric period into manageable, meaningful segments. Under this reading, the king list becomes something else entirely, something far more valuable than a simple chronicle of rulers. It becomes a compressed history of human cultural development, the record of the stages through which society passed on its way from small villages to great cities, from subsistence farming to surplus economy, from oral tradition to written law. Consider what we know from archaeology about the development of civilization in Mesopotamia. The earliest permanent settlements appear around 8000 BCE in the northern regions, small villages practicing early forms of agriculture. Over thousands of years, these communities grow larger, develop pottery, begin to practice irrigation, establish trade networks. Around 6500 BCE, the Ubaid culture emerges in the south, with distinctive cultural markers and the first evidence of temple architecture. The Ubaid period itself spans nearly 3 millennia, during which we can track increasingly sophisticated social organization, more complex irrigation systems, larger settlements, and the gradual development of social hierarchy and specialized labor. Then, around 4000 BCE, the Uruk period begins, and suddenly we see true cities, massive temple complexes, cylinder seals for marking property, and the first writing. This developmental sequence, stretching from 8000 BCE to 3000 BCE, covers roughly 5000 years of human history. It's a long, slow process of innovation and social complexity, each generation building slightly on the knowledge of the previous one. But what if this visible sequence is itself just the final phase of something much older? What if we're looking at Civilization 7.0, the seventh iteration of complex society in this region, and the previous 6 versions left only fragmentary traces, either because they were destroyed by flooding or because their remains lie beneath layers of later occupation, or because they existed in regions we haven't excavated yet or can't excavate because they're now underwater? The evidence for this possibility comes from multiple directions. First, there's the linguistic evidence. The Sumerian language is what linguists call an isolate. It has no known relatives, no clear connection to any other language family. It stands alone, which is extremely unusual. Most ancient languages can be traced to larger family groups. Indo-European languages spread from a common ancestor. Semitic languages share clear relationships. But Sumerian is orphaned, suggesting either that its language family went extinct with no other survivors, or that it evolved in isolation for a very long period, or that it developed in a region where related languages existed but whose speakers left no archaeological record. The Sumerian language also contains a puzzling feature. Embedded within it are loanwords, terms borrowed from another language, a language that scholars call Proto-Euphratean. These loanwords relate specifically to technical terms, words for farmer, smith, weaver, potter, merchant. They're the vocabulary of civilization itself. This suggests that the Sumerians, when they arrived in southern Mesopotamia, or when their language began to dominate the region, encountered a people who already had complex society, who already practiced all the key technologies of urban life, and the Sumerians simply borrowed the existing technical vocabulary. The Proto-Euphrateans, whoever they were, already had words for all these things because they were already doing them. So where did the Proto-Euphrateans come from? Who were they? And more importantly, who taught them? If we follow the logic back, we find ourselves in an endless regression, each culture learning from a predecessor, each civilization building on the ruins of the one before. Second, there's the technological evidence. Multiple innovations appear in the Mesopotamian archaeological record without clear developmental sequences. Pottery appears suddenly, already sophisticated. The potter's wheel emerges fully formed. Metallurgy, the smelting and working of copper, shows up in the archaeological record with surprising complexity right from the start. These aren't technologies you invent overnight. They require generations of experimentation, countless failures, gradual refinement. Yet in many cases we don't see the learning curve. We see the finished product. This pattern suggests that the development happened somewhere else, or somewhen else, and only the fully mature technology made it into the archaeological record we can access. It's as if someone else did the hard work of innovation, and the people we call Sumerians inherited the results. Which brings us to the third line of evidence, the astronomical and mathematical knowledge embedded in Sumerian texts. The Sumerians had sophisticated astronomy. They tracked the movements of planets, predicted eclipses, maintained detailed sky charts. They understood the precession of the equinoxes, a slow wobble in Earth's rotation that takes 25,920 years to complete one cycle. They divided the sky into 12 zodiacal constellations, marked the solstices and equinoxes, and developed a lunar-solar calendar that required complex calculation to maintain. This level of astronomical knowledge doesn't develop quickly. It requires centuries of continuous observation, record-keeping, and mathematical analysis. You need multiple generations of astronomers, each building on the work of their predecessors, each adding to an accumulated body of knowledge. The mathematics are equally impressive. The Sumerian sexagesimal system, the base 60 mathematics they used, is actually more sophisticated than our base 10 system in many ways. Base 60 is highly divisible, having 60, 30, 20, 15, 12, 10, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, and 1 as factors. This makes complex fractions and calculations much easier. But here's the question. Why base 60? Why not base 10, which seems more natural given that humans have 10 fingers? The choice of base 60 suggests deep astronomical motivations. The number 360, which is 6 times 60, approximates the number of days in a year. The 12 months, the 30-day months, the division of day and night into 12 hours each, the 60-minute hours, the 60-second minutes, all of this comes from the Sumerian sexagesimal system, a system that seems designed by people who are deeply engaged with astronomical observation over very long periods of time. Could this knowledge have been developed in a few centuries? Theoretically, yes. But the sophistication suggests something longer, a tradition of sky watching stretching back not hundreds but thousands of years. And if that tradition stretches back thousands of years before the first Sumerian written records, around 3200 BCE, then we're talking about astronomical observation beginning in 5000 BCE or earlier, during periods we consider prehistoric, during times when conventional history says humans were barely beyond Stone Age existence. Yet someone was watching the sky, counting the days, recording the movements of the stars, building the mathematical framework that would become the foundation of Mesopotamian science. Fourth, there's the architectural evidence. The temple at Eridu, in its earliest form dating to around 5400 BCE, shows architectural sophistication that seems to come from nowhere. It's not crude or experimental. It follows a clear plan, a canonical form that would be repeated with variations for thousands of years. The temple consists of a rectangular central room, the cella, where the cult statue stood, surrounded by smaller rooms and chambers. The entrance is positioned precisely, the proportions carefully calculated, the orientation aligned to cardinal directions. This isn't someone figuring out how to build a temple. This is someone executing a design that already exists as a concept, following rules and traditions that are already well established. Where did those rules come from? Who established them? The conventional answer is that the development must have happened in mud brick architecture that didn't survive, or in regions we haven't excavated. But that just pushes the question back. Someone, somewhere, at some time, developed these architectural principles, refined them through trial and error, established them as canonical forms. That development took time, probably centuries, and it had to happen before 5400 BCE, before the earliest Eridu temple. So we're talking about architectural traditions stretching back to 6000 BCE or earlier, into periods where archaeology shows us only small villages and modest structures. The disconnect between what we expect to find and what we actually find keeps growing. This leads us into the truly speculative territory, but speculation grounded in real anomalies, in genuine puzzles that conventional archaeology struggles to fully explain. What if there were 7 previous attempts at civilization in Mesopotamia and the surrounding regions? What if each attempt reached a certain level of complexity, lasted for centuries or even millennia, and then collapsed due to environmental catastrophe, disease, warfare, or social breakdown? What if each collapse was severe enough that most of the population died or dispersed? Most of the material culture was destroyed or buried, but some knowledge survived, carried forward by a small group of survivors or transmitted through oral tradition, myth, ritual. What if Sumer, the civilization we can see in the archaeological record, represents not a first flowering but a seventh rebirth, the latest in a series of cultural renaissances, each one building on fragmentary memories of what came before? Under this model, the antediluvian section of the king list becomes a chronicle of these previous civilizations. Each king represents a distinct cultural phase, a period when a particular center dominated the region, when a particular way of organizing society prevailed. The 5 cities mentioned, Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak, might not have all existed simultaneously in the antediluvian period. Instead, each might represent the successive capitals of these previous civilizations, each one rising as the previous center fell. Let's try to sketch what these 7 civilizations might have looked like based on the fragmentary evidence available. The first civilization, represented by Alulim's reign in Eridu, might have been the earliest Ubaid phase, the period around 6,500 to 6,000 BCE, when agriculture and irrigation first took hold in southern Mesopotamia. This would have been a time of small villages, simple pottery, early temple building, the very beginning of surplus economy and social hierarchy. The population was small, probably just a few thousand people across the entire region, but they made the crucial transition from mobile foraging to settled farming, from temporary camps to permanent villages. This first civilization lasted perhaps 500 years before something went wrong, perhaps a period of drought, perhaps flooding, perhaps disease, something that caused the population to crash and the settlements to be abandoned. But the knowledge didn't die completely. Survivors carried forward the basic technologies, the knowledge of irrigation, the principles of temple architecture, the understanding that surplus grain could be stored and distributed through a central authority. The second civilization, perhaps represented by Alaljar's reign also in Eridu, might mark the recovery and rebuilding period, maybe 6,000 to 5,500 BCE. The population recovered, settlements were rebuilt, often on the ruins of the earlier phase. New pottery styles emerged, irrigation systems were expanded, trade networks began to form. This second attempt lasted longer, perhaps 500 years again, and achieved greater sophistication. More people, larger villages, more complex social organization. But again, something caused collapse. The pattern repeats. The third civilization, perhaps moving to Bad Tibira as indicated in the king list, might represent a new phase around 5,500 to 5,000 BCE, a period where the cultural center shifted slightly, where new innovations appeared. This could be when the potter's wheel was introduced, when copper working began, when temple architecture became more sophisticated. The fourth civilization, continuing the sequence, would bring further technological advances, perhaps the development of cylinder seals for marking property, the beginning of symbolic record-keeping that would eventually evolve into writing, the expansion of trade networks to bring in materials not available locally, timber from Lebanon, copper from Anatolia, stone from Iran. Each civilization built higher, quite literally, on the rubble of its predecessors. In Mesopotamian archaeology tells, those great mounds that mark ancient cities are formed by thousands of years of occupation, each generation building on the ruins of the previous one. In some tells, the archaeological deposits reach depths of 20 meters or more, representing dozens of occupation phases stretching back thousands of years. The lower you dig, the older the remains, and in the very lowest levels you find the earliest traces of settlement. But even the lowest levels excavated so far might not be the bottom. Groundwater, the difficulty of excavation, the sheer cost and time involved mean that many tells have never been excavated to their base. What lies beneath the deepest layers we've reached? What earlier phases of occupation remain undiscovered? The fifth civilization might be when true social complexity emerged. when chiefdoms evolved into something approaching early states, when the temple priesthood became a real power controlling land and labor, when craft specialization became pronounced with potters, weavers, smiths, merchants, each forming distinct groups with their own traditions and interests. This is the phase where we start to see evidence of walls around settlements, suggesting warfare or at least the fear of attack. Competition between settlements increased. Trade became not just exchange of goods, but a political tool, a way to form alliances and demonstrate power. The sixth civilization would then represent the Late Ubaid period, the final cultural phase before the emergence of Uruk and the development of writing. This is when settlements became large enough to really qualify as towns, when temple complexes grew to dominate the landscape, when social hierarchy became deeply entrenched with clear distinctions between elite and common people, when specialization reached the point that some people never farmed at all but lived entirely on food produced by others. This is the threshold of urbanism, the moment when village life transformed into city life. But something happened. The Late Ubaid period ends rather abruptly in the archaeological record around 3800 BCE. There's a cultural break, a change in pottery styles, settlement patterns, burial practices. Something disrupted the existing social order. Then came the seventh civilization, the one we call Uruk, the one that developed writing and with it stepped from prehistory into history. But Uruk didn't start from scratch. It built on everything that came before, on 6 previous attempts at complex society, on thousands of years of accumulated knowledge, on the hard-won lessons of all those earlier collapses. The people of Uruk knew how to irrigate because 6 previous civilizations had perfected irrigation. They knew how to build temples because the architectural tradition stretched back 2,000 years. They knew mathematics and astronomy because generations of priest astronomers had been watching the skies for millennia. They knew how to organize large groups of people for collective labor because social hierarchy had been developing for thousands of years. All Uruk had to do was put it all together, formalize it, write it down, and once they wrote it down, it became permanent. Knowledge could now be transmitted without relying on human memory, without the risk that if the old priest died before teaching the young priest, the knowledge would be lost. With writing, civilization became robust, resilient. The seventh civilization, unlike the first 6, would not easily collapse because the knowledge base was too large, too distributed, too deeply embedded in written texts that could survive even if cities burned and populations died. This is why Sumer appears so suddenly sophisticated in the archaeological record. It's not that they invented everything at once, it's that they were the first to write everything down, creating the illusion of sudden emergence. Now, this interpretation of the king list as a chronicle of 7 previous civilizations is not mainstream archaeology. Most scholars would say the evidence is too fragmentary, the interpretation too speculative, the gaps in our knowledge too large to support such specific claims, and they're right to be cautious. Archaeology is a science. It requires evidence. It requires careful analysis. It requires resisting the temptation to fill gaps in knowledge with attractive stories. But here's what we can say with confidence. 1. The Mesopotamian archaeological record shows at least 7 distinct cultural phases between 8000 BCE and 3000 BCE, each building on the previous one, each adding to the accumulated knowledge base. 2. The Sumerian king list preserves memory of an antediluvian period with 8 kings ruling 5 cities, kings whose reign lengths seem to encode information about deep time, about long cultural periods rather than individual human lifespans. 3. The earliest levels of settlement at places like Eridu show surprising sophistication, suggesting that the builders were working from an existing template, following traditions already well established. 4. The Sumerian language contains loan words from a pre-Sumerian language, indicating that when the Sumerian language became dominant, it encountered a people who already had civilization, who already had technical vocabulary for all the key technologies. 5. Multiple aspects of Sumerian culture, their astronomy, mathematics, architecture, agricultural techniques, appear in the record already sophisticated, without clear developmental sequences visible in the archaeology. These 5 facts don't prove the 7 civilizations hypothesis, but they make it plausible. They suggest that the story of human civilization in Mesopotamia is longer and more complex than the simple narrative of Sumerians' invented civilization around 3500 BCE. They open the door to deeper questions about cultural memory, about how knowledge is transmitted across generations and across catastrophes, about what kinds of information can be encoded in myths and king lists and religious texts. If we take the Sumerian texts seriously, not as literal history but as encoded information about the past, what else might they tell us? The flood narrative, for instance, appears in multiple Mesopotamian texts, most famously in the Epic of Gilgamesh, but also in older Sumerian versions predating Gilgamesh by centuries. These flood stories describe a cataclysmic deluge that destroyed civilization, killing almost all humans, with only a single righteous man and his family surviving by building a boat and riding out the disaster. For a long time, scholars dismissed this as pure mythology, perhaps a memory of river flooding blown out of proportion. But then geological evidence started accumulating that the Black Sea region experienced a massive flood event around 5600 BCE, when rising Mediterranean waters broke through the Bosporus, flooding what had been a low-lying freshwater lake and turning it into the brackish Black Sea we know today. This flood would have inundated coastal settlements, forcing populations to flee, creating exactly the kind of cultural trauma that would be remembered in myth for thousands of years. More recent geological work in the Persian Gulf has revealed evidence of rapid sea level rise at the end of the last ice age, with the Gulf expanding significantly between 8000 and 5000 BCE, flooding coastal plains that had been occupied by humans. If there were settlements in these lowland areas, settlements practicing early agriculture, building early temples, developing the foundations of civilization, they would have been drowned, their populations dispersed, their knowledge scattered. The survivors fleeing inland would carry memories of the disaster, memories of a time before the flood, when their ancestors lived in a different land, a better land, a paradise lost. These memories would be preserved in oral tradition, passed down through generations, eventually written down centuries or millennia later, in the form we now read in Sumerian and Akkadian texts. So the flood wasn't one event but multiple events, a series of disasters stretching over thousands of years as sea levels rose and climates shifted at the end of the Ice Age. Each disaster would have disrupted existing societies, causing collapses, forcing migrations, breaking the continuity of cultural transmission. But each time some knowledge survived, carried by refugees, preserved in rituals and songs and stories, eventually reconstituted when conditions stabilized and populations recovered. This pattern of collapse and recovery, death and rebirth, destruction and reconstruction, might be what the antediluvian section of the king list is really describing. Not a single flood, but a long period of instability and repeated catastrophes, during which 7 different attempts at civilization rose and fell, each one reaching a certain level of complexity before being overwhelmed by forces beyond human control. The number 7 itself carries deep significance in Mesopotamian thought. 7 appears constantly in their religious texts, their mathematical systems, their cosmology. 7 sages brought civilization to humanity according to Mesopotamian myth, teaching the arts of agriculture, architecture, writing, and magic. 7 gates guard the underworld, which the soul must pass through after death. 7 planets were known to ancient astronomers: the Sun, Moon, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, the 7 wandering stars whose movements govern time and fate. The week has 7 days, each named for one of these celestial bodies, a system that ultimately derives from Mesopotamian astronomy and astrology. 7 is the number of completeness, of fullness, of a cycle completed. When you count to 7 in Mesopotamian thought, you've encompassed the whole, you've accounted for all the parts, you've reached the end of a sequence. So if the antediluvian period represents 7 civilizations as 7 cultural cycles, it would make sense from a Mesopotamian perspective to structure the chronicle that way, to organize the deep past into 7 epochs, each one a complete cycle of rise and fall, growth and decay, order and chaos. The 8th king, the final antediluvian ruler before the flood, would then represent not another civilization but the transition point, the moment of final catastrophe, the end of the old world and the beginning of the new. After the 8th king, after the flood, kingship descends from heaven again, and the historical period begins. The post-flood kings have shorter reigns, more human lifespans, because now we're in historical time, the time of written records and verifiable events, no longer in mythic time, the deep time of cultural memory and cosmic cycles. This brings us to one of the most intriguing aspects of the king list, the specific mathematical relationships between the antediluvian reign lengths. These aren't random numbers. They follow precise patterns based on the sexagesimal system. When you analyze them mathematically, they reveal deliberate structure, numerical relationships that suggest sophisticated encoding of information. Some researchers have proposed that these numbers represent astronomical cycles, periods of planetary alignment or precession that could only be known through long-term observation. The largest reign length, 43,200 years for the king and Menluana of Sippa, is exactly 432,000 divided by 10. The number 432,000 appears in Hindu cosmology as the length of the Kali Yuga, one of the cosmic ages. This correspondence has led to speculation about ancient contact between Mesopotamian and Indian cultures, or about both cultures drawing on an even older shared tradition, a common source of astronomical knowledge dating back to before the civilizations we know. The number 432 has special significance. It's related to the precession of the equinoxes, which takes about 25,920 years to complete. Divide that by 60, and you get 432. The number appears in mythologies and sacred texts across multiple cultures, always associated with cosmic cycles, with the ages of the world, with the passage of vast spans of time. Did the Mesopotamians understand precession? The textual evidence is ambiguous, but the numerical evidence suggests they might have. They certainly had the observational capability. If you track the position of the sun at dawn on the spring equinox over multiple generations, you can detect the slow shift as precession moves the sun's position against the background stars. Over a century, the shift is noticeable. Over centuries, it's unmistakable. But to detect precession requires continuous observation over very long periods, multiple generations of astronomers each contributing data to a growing corpus of knowledge. This suggests institutional continuity, an unbroken chain of astronomical observers stretching back centuries if not millennia. The temple complexes of Mesopotamia could have served this function. The priesthood was hereditary, knowledge passed from father to son, teacher to student, maintaining traditions across generations. If the priests of Eridu had been watching the skies since 5400 BCE, by the time writing was invented around 3200 BCE, they would have accumulated over 2,000 years of astronomical data. That's more than enough to detect precession, to understand the long cycles, to recognize patterns that unfold over periods longer than human memory. This astronomical knowledge would have been precious, sacred, the domain of the priesthood, carefully guarded and transmitted only to initiates. When writing was finally developed, this knowledge could be recorded, formalized, preserved in cuneiform tablets. But the knowledge itself was much older than writing. It stretched back into the oral tradition, into the time before writing, into the antediluvian period. Perhaps the antediluvian kings aren't kings at all, but astronomical periods, epochs marked by specific celestial configurations that repeated on long cycles. Perhaps the reign of Alulim represents the time when a particular constellation rose heliacally at the spring equinox, and his reign ended when precession shifted the equinox to a different constellation. Under this interpretation, the king list becomes an astronomical text, a way of organizing cosmic time, of recording the long cycles of the heavens as observed over thousands of years. This astronomical interpretation would explain why the numbers are so precise, why they follow mathematical patterns, why they're based on the sexagesimal system that was specifically designed for astronomical calculation. It would also explain why the text was considered so important that multiple copies were made and preserved across different cities and time periods. This wasn't just a political document establishing the legitimacy of kings, it was a cosmological text, a record of sacred knowledge about the structure of time itself. But even if this astronomical interpretation is correct, it doesn't preclude the civilizational interpretation. The two could work together. The astronomical periods might have been aligned with cultural periods, the long cycles of the heavens mirroring the long cycles of human society, the rise and fall of civilization synchronized with cosmic time. This kind of thinking, where earthly events mirror celestial patterns, where the microcosm reflects the macrocosm, is central to Mesopotamian thought. As above, so below. The order of the heavens provides the template for the order of society. Kings are crowned when planets align. Wars are fought when omens appear in the sky. The calendar itself synchronizes human time with cosmic time, making sure that religious festivals occur at the right moment in both the seasonal cycle and the celestial cycle. If this way of thinking stretches back into the Ubaid period, into the time before writing, then the antediluvian section of the king list might be recording both astronomical periods and civilizational periods, seeing them as inseparable, two aspects of a single cosmic order. Let's return to the specific cities mentioned in the antediluvian section. 5 cities: Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, and Shuruppak. All 5 have been identified archaeologically. Eridu is the best known, excavated extensively in the mid-20th century. The site revealed 18 levels of temple rebuilding, each temple constructed directly over the ruins of the previous one, stretching from the Ubaid period, around 5400 BCE, down to the Neo-Babylonian period, around 600 BCE, nearly 5,000 years of continuous religious activity on the same sacred spot. This is extraordinary continuity, suggesting that the site held deep significance throughout Mesopotamian history. The city was dedicated to Enki, the god of wisdom, magic, fresh water, and creation. Enki was considered humanity's friend, the god who taught humans the arts of civilization, who saved humanity from the flood by warning the survivor and instructing him to build a boat. Enki's temple at Eridu, the Iabzu, was considered the house of the cosmic underground ocean, the source of all fresh water, the foundation of life itself. To worship at Eridu was to connect with the very source of existence. Bad Tibira, the second antediluvian city, has been less extensively excavated, but the site shows occupation in the Ubaid and Uruk periods. The city was associated with metalworking, with craft production, with the technologies that transform raw materials into useful objects. The name Bad Tibira might mean fortress of the copper workers, suggesting that this was a center of metallurgical innovation, a place where smiths developed techniques for smelting and working metal. Larak remains largely unexplored, its exact location uncertain, though several candidate sites exist. The ancient texts associate it with divine judgments, with the weighing of human deeds, with the establishment of cosmic law. Sippar, the 4th city, is well known from later periods as a major cult center for the sun god Shamash. In the antediluvian section of the king list, Sippar appears as the seat of Enmenluana, the king with the longest recorded reign, 43,200 years. This association with the sun god, with light, with the heavenly realm, and with the longest reign suggests that Sippar held special cosmological significance, perhaps as an astronomical observation site, perhaps as a place where time itself was measured and recorded. Shuruppak, the final antediluvian city, is the home of Ziusudra in Sumerian tradition, or Utnapishtim in Akkadian tradition, the flood hero who built the ark and survived the deluge. The city's association with the flood narrative is deep and consistent across multiple versions of the story. Archaeological excavation at Shuruppak has revealed a flood layer in the early dynastic period, evidence of major inundation that destroyed the settlement around 2900 BCE. This archaeological flood layer has sometimes been cited as evidence for the historical reality of the flood narrative, though the dating doesn't match the antediluvian period described in the king list. More likely, Shuruppak experienced multiple flood events over its long history, and memories of these disasters were woven together in the mythic narrative. These 5 cities then weren't just random settlements. Each had specific significance, specific associations with aspects of civilization and cosmic order. Eridu represented the foundation, the source, the beginning of all things. Bad Tibiro represented technological innovation, the transformation of nature through craft. Larak represented law, justice, the moral order. Sippar represented knowledge, astronomy, the understanding of cosmic time. Shuruppak represented survival, resilience, the ability to endure catastrophe. Together, the 5 cities encompass the full range of human civilization: religious devotion, technological skill, legal order, scientific knowledge, and survival instinct. If we read the antediluvian section as describing 7 civilizational phases, these 5 cities might represent the key centers during different phases, each one rising to prominence when its particular strength was most needed by society. During the first phase, Eridu dominated because what society needed most was religious cohesion, a shared cosmology to bind communities together. During later phases, when technology became crucial for further development, Bad Tibiro's metallurgical expertise made it the center. When social complexity required legal systems to manage conflict and coordinate labor, Larak's association with justice brought it to prominence. When astronomical knowledge became essential for calendar keeping and agricultural timing, Sippar's sun temple and observational astronomy made it the key site. And finally, when environmental catastrophe threatened society's very survival, Shuruppak, the city associated with the flood and with survival, became the last great center before the deluge swept over. This reading makes the king list not just a chronicle but a sophisticated organizational scheme, a way of categorizing the long development of civilization into meaningful phases, each phase associated with a particular center and a particular focus. Modern archaeology might divide the prehistoric period into phases like Ubaid I, Ubaid II, Uruk-Iva, Uruk-Ifi, based on pottery styles and architectural changes. The ancient Mesopotamians might have divided the same period into phases based on which city held cultural prominence and what aspect of civilization was most developed during that time. Different organizational schemes, but both attempting to impose order on the chaos of the past, to divide continuous change into discrete periods that can be understood and discussed. The question remains, how much of this organizational scheme reflects actual historical memory, and how much is retrospective interpretation, priests in the 3rd millennium BCE looking back at the deep past and organizing it according to their cosmological and political needs? We probably can't fully separate the two. The king list as we have it was compiled around 2000 BCE, nearly 4,000 years after the earliest events it purports to describe. That's a long game of telephone. Even if the priesthood maintained careful oral traditions, details would be lost, confused, transformed. But the broad outline, the general pattern, might preserve real information about the sequence of cultural development, the succession of centers, the long arc of civilization's emergence. Let's consider what might have caused the collapses that ended each of these civilizational phases. In a region like southern Mesopotamia, highly dependent on irrigation agriculture, vulnerable to flooding from rivers and sea level changes, subject to droughts and climate variability, civilization is always fragile. The systems that make surplus possible, the irrigation canals, the storage facilities, the trade networks, all require constant maintenance, continuous labor, stable social organization. Anything that disrupts that stability can trigger cascade failure. A major flood destroys irrigation infrastructure. Fields can't be planted, harvests fail, food stores run out, people starve or migrate away, the population drops. There aren't enough people to maintain the remaining infrastructure. More systems fail, More people leave. The settlement shrinks back to a small village or is abandoned entirely. Knowledge held by specialists, the metallurgist, the scribe, the astronomer priest, is lost when those specialists die without apprentices to teach. Within a generation or two, a sophisticated town can revert to a simple farming village. This pattern has been documented historically in many regions. Civilizations are more fragile than we like to think. It doesn't take an asteroid strike or volcanic eruption to cause collapse. Often, it just takes a few bad harvests in a row, or a generation of incompetent leadership, or a disease outbreak, or the breakdown of trade networks due to warfare or political instability. Once the spiral of decline begins, it can be very difficult to stop. In Mesopotamia's prehistory, before writing allowed for the preservation and transmission of complex knowledge, each collapse would have been particularly devastating. The knowledge base wasn't written down, it existed in human memory, in apprenticeship traditions, in oral teaching. When the teachers died without passing on their knowledge, that knowledge disappeared. The survivors of a collapse might retain some basic skills, farming, pottery making, simple craft production, but the more sophisticated knowledge, the astronomy, the mathematics, the architectural principles, the medical techniques, would be lost or severely degraded. Each recovery, then, would have to partially reinvent what had been lost, building back up from a reduced base. But not entirely from scratch. Some knowledge would survive in ritual, in traditional practices whose original meaning had been forgotten, but whose forms were preserved. The survivors might not remember why the temple had to be oriented to the cardinal directions, but they would remember that it had to be, and they would preserve that practice. Later generations, rebuilding, would follow the traditional forms without understanding their original astronomical significance. Over many cycles of collapse and recovery, knowledge would accumulate incrementally. Each recovery would reach a bit higher than the previous one because some additional knowledge had been preserved. Some new technique had been invented during the previous cycle and managed to survive into the next. Gradually, fitfully, civilization would advance. 2 steps forward, 1 step back, repeated over thousands of years. This is a more realistic model of cultural development than the idea of steady linear progress. Real history doesn't move in straight lines. It spirals, it loops, it advances and retreats. But the overall trend over long enough time periods can still be upward, toward greater complexity, more sophisticated technology, larger populations, more extensive knowledge. The 7th civilization, classical Sumer, broke this cycle because they developed writing. With writing, knowledge became external to human memory. It could survive individual deaths, could be copied and distributed, could accumulate without limit. A scribe dying didn't mean the loss of his knowledge if he had written it down. The library could be consulted. New scribes could be trained from texts rather than just from oral teaching. This was revolutionary. This is why we date history from the invention of writing. Before writing, we're dependent on archaeology, on fragmentary material remains, on inference and interpretation. After writing, we have direct testimony, the voices of the past speaking to us across millennia. But those voices also tell us that they remembered a time before writing, a long age when knowledge was transmitted orally, when kings reigned for impossibly long periods, when the gods walked the earth, when civilization began in Eridu and spread from there to all the world. Should we dismiss these memories as pure mythology, or should we recognize them as distorted, compressed, mythologized accounts of real history, the deep history before writing, the 7 long phases of cultural development that led to the emergence of the civilization we call Sumer? The evidence doesn't give us a definitive answer. We can't prove that 7 distinct civilizations rose and fell in prehistoric Mesopotamia, but we can say that the archaeological record shows multiple phases of cultural development over thousands of years. We can say that the Sumerian king list preserves memory of an antediluvian period with specific cities and specific rulers. We can say that Sumerian culture shows signs of building on much older traditions, incorporating knowledge that must have taken many centuries to develop. And we can say that the pattern of collapse and recovery, of civilizations rising and falling in the face of environmental and social stresses, is a pattern repeated throughout human history. If we accept even the possibility that the antediluvian section of the King List encodes real information about prehistoric cultural phases, it changes how we think about the development of civilization. We move away from the model of sudden invention, of Sumerians creating civilization from scratch, and toward a model of long accumulation, of many failed attempts and partial successes, of knowledge slowly building over thousands of years through cycles of disaster and recovery. This model is actually more consistent with what we know about cultural evolution from anthropology and archaeology in other regions. Civilization rarely appears suddenly. It emerges gradually from long processes of social and technological development. The appearance of suddenness is often just an artifact of incomplete preservation, of the earlier phases being less visible in the archaeological record because they were less monumentally built, or because their remains are buried deeper and haven't been excavated, or because they were destroyed by later building. When we look at other early civilizations, Egypt, the Indus Valley, China, Mesoamerica, we see similar patterns. There's always a long development period before the emergence of the state-level societies we recognize as civilizations. In Egypt, there are pre-dynastic phases stretching back thousands of years before the first pharaohs. In the Indus Valley, there are early Harappan phases centuries before the mature Harappan civilization. In China, there are Neolithic cultures like Yangshao and Longshan that precede the Shang dynasty. Everywhere we look, civilization has deep roots, building on long traditions of cultural development. Sumer is no different in this respect. What makes Sumer special is that they wrote down memories of their own deep past, preserving in the King List a chronicle that reaches back beyond writing into the oral tradition, into the mythic time before history. Most civilizations don't give us such detailed accounts of their own origins. Most origin myths are more obviously mythological, involving gods creating the world, divine ancestors, supernatural events. The Sumerian King List, while certainly mythological in parts, has a different character. It presents itself as a historical chronicle, a list of rulers and cities and reign lengths, the kind of document that later sections demonstrably are. The later sections of the King List, covering the 3rd and 2nd millennia BCE, can be cross-checked against other historical sources, and they're largely accurate. The cities existed, the dynasties existed. Many of the individual kings can be verified from other inscriptions. So the Sumerians knew how to keep accurate historical records. They knew the difference between myth and history. When they included the antediluvian section at the beginning of the King List, were they deliberately recording myth, creating a sacred prehistory to give antiquity to their institutions? Or were they recording what they believed to be actual history, the chronicle of their ancestors stretching back into deep time, even if the details had become garbled and exaggerated through millennia of oral transmission? We might never know for certain. But the question is worth asking because it affects how we interpret not just the King List, but Sumerian culture more broadly. If we assume everything in Sumerian literature is pure invention, creative mythology with no historical basis, we miss the possibility that some of their texts preserve real memories, real information about the past, encoded in mythic language. On the other hand, if we assume everything is literally true, we end up with kings who lived 30,000 years, which is obviously impossible. The truth, as always, is somewhere in between. Some Sumerian texts are pure mythology, some are accurate history, some are history filtered through myth, real events transformed by retelling into something more dramatic, more cosmologically significant, more meaningful. The skill is in learning to tell which is which, and that requires understanding their culture, their way of thinking, their cosmology and theology. It requires reading between the lines, looking for the kernel of historical truth within the mythic narrative. The Seven Civilizations hypothesis is one attempt at this kind of reading. It takes the antediluvian section of the King List seriously as a historical source, but not literally. It looks for the real history encoded in the fantastic numbers, the actual cultural memory preserved in the mythic narrative. And it proposes that what the King List is chronicling is the long, slow, repeated process of cultural development in Mesopotamia over thousands of years, a process marked by multiple attempts at complex society, each one reaching a certain level before collapsing, but each one contributing to the accumulated knowledge that would eventually flower in classical Sumer. Is this interpretation correct? The archaeological evidence neither proves nor disproves it. What we can say is that it's consistent with the available evidence, that it explains some of the anomalies in the Sumerian record, and that it provides a framework for thinking about cultural development that incorporates both the archaeological data and the textual evidence from the Sumerians themselves. It also has the virtue of taking seriously what the Mesopotamians themselves said about their own past, treating their texts as potential sources of information rather than dismissing them out of hand as fantasy. The ancient Mesopotamians were smart, careful observers of their world. They developed sophisticated mathematics, astronomy, engineering, law, literature, and bureaucracy. They created one of the most successful and long-lasting civilizations in human history, one that dominated the Near East for 3,000 years. When they told us that their civilization stretched back into deep time, that it had gone through multiple phases before reaching its classical form, that it had survived catastrophes and collapses, that it incorporated knowledge from many previous generations, we should at least consider that they might know what they're talking about. They were closer to their own past than we are. They had access to oral traditions, to earlier texts that haven't survived, to cultural memories that we've lost. Their account might be mythologized, but it's not necessarily fabricated. There might be real history in there, waiting to be extracted by careful analysis and comparison with archaeological evidence. Let's consider one final piece of evidence: the Sumerian flood narrative itself. Multiple versions of this story exist in Sumerian, Akkadian, and other Mesopotamian languages. The most famous version is in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the hero Gilgamesh meets Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who has been granted immortality by the gods. Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh the story of how the gods decided to destroy humanity with a flood, how the god Ea secretly warned him, how he built a great boat and loaded it with his family and animals, how the flood came and destroyed all life, how the boat grounded on a mountain, how he sent out birds to find dry land, how he finally emerged and made sacrifice to the gods. The similarities to the biblical Noah story are obvious and have been recognized since the Epic of Gilgamesh was first translated in the 19th century, but the Mesopotamian versions are older, much older. The earliest Sumerian version of the flood story dates to around 2000 BCE, 1,000 years before the biblical text was composed. The flood narrative is deeply embedded in Mesopotamian culture. It appears not just in literature but in the king list, in omen texts, in historical chronicles. It's treated as a historical event, a major dividing line between the antediluvian period and the historical period. Everything before the flood is clouded in myth. Everything after is clearer, more historical. The flood marks the boundary between prehistory and history. But was there really a flood? Archaeology has found flood deposits at multiple Mesopotamian sites, but they don't all date to the same period. Some are from the late 4th millennium, some from the early 3rd millennium, some from later periods. There was no single catastrophic flood that inundated all of Mesopotamia simultaneously. But there were many floods over the millennia, because Mesopotamia is flood-prone, situated in a river valley with unpredictable water levels, no natural drainage, and low-lying coastal areas vulnerable to sea level rise. The biblical and Mesopotamian flood stories might preserve memory not of a single event but of the long period of environmental instability at the end of the last ice age. When sea levels were rising, river systems were shifting, climate was changing, and coastal populations were repeatedly displaced by encroaching waters. Each generation might have experienced its own flood disaster. Each community might have its own flood story, and over time these multiple memories coalesced into a single grand narrative of the flood, a mythic event that represented all the real floods, all the disasters, all the times when the world seemed to be ending. Under this interpretation, the antediluvian period represents the entire late Pleistocene and early Holocene, The long span from perhaps 10,000 BCE to 3000 BCE, during which sea levels rose hundreds of feet, drowning coastal plains, forcing populations to migrate, destroying settlements, and forcing societies to constantly rebuild in new locations. The 7 civilizations would then be 7 phases of this long period, 7 attempts to establish stable, complex societies in a region undergoing massive environmental change. Each attempt eventually failed when environmental conditions shifted again, but each attempt contributed knowledge, techniques, and traditions to the next attempt. The final attempt, classical Sumer, succeeded in establishing lasting civilization because by that time, around 3000 BCE, the environmental changes had stabilized. Sea levels had reached approximately modern levels. The river systems had settled into predictable courses. The climate had stabilized. For the first time in thousands of years, conditions were stable enough to support large, permanent settlements, extensive irrigation systems, surplus agriculture, and all the complexity that we associate with civilization. Sumer didn't succeed because the Sumerians were smarter than their predecessors. They succeeded because they lived at the right time, when environmental conditions finally allowed civilization to flourish. But they built on the accumulated knowledge of all those previous failed attempts, all those earlier societies that had struggled against impossible odds, that had learned through trial and error how to farm, how to irrigate, how to build, how to organize, how to survive. This perspective reframes the 7 civilizations from a sequence of discrete entities to phases of a single long process, a 7,000-year struggle to establish human civilization in a region undergoing dramatic environmental change. Each phase brought new innovations, new solutions to the challenges posed by the environment and by social organization. Each phase collapsed when conditions changed beyond the society's ability to adapt. But the knowledge accumulated. The techniques were remembered. The next phase started from a higher baseline, and eventually, after 7 phases of experimentation, a stable civilization emerged, one that could survive, that could grow, that could record its own history and pass that history down to us. If this is the real story encoded in the Sumerian king list, it's more impressive than the simple story of sudden invention. It shows human persistence, resilience, creativity in the face of enormous challenges. It shows that civilization isn't a gift from the gods, but a hard-won achievement, built slowly over many generations, through countless failures and incremental successes. And it suggests that we should look more carefully at other origin myths, other ancient chronicles of the deep past. They might not be simply fantasy. They might be encoded history, cultural memory preserved through myth and ritual, waiting to be decoded by combining textual analysis with archaeology, geology, climatology, and anthropology. The past is deeper and stranger than we thought. The story of civilization is longer and more complex, and the ancient texts that we've sometimes dismissed as primitive mythology might actually be sophisticated attempts to record and transmit knowledge about the deep past, knowledge that we're only now beginning to recover and understand. There's one more dimension to consider, the linguistic dimension, the information encoded in language itself. The Sumerian language, as we mentioned earlier, is an isolate with no known relatives, but embedded within Sumerian are loanwords from another language, the Proto-Euphratean substrate language. These loanwords are technical terms, the vocabulary of civilization: farmer, weaver, smith, merchant, architect, scribe. The significance of this can't be overstated. When a language borrows technical vocabulary from another language, it means that the speakers of the borrowing language encountered the borrowed technology from speakers of the source language. The Proto-Euphrateans, whoever they were, already had all the technologies of civilization when the Sumerian language became dominant in southern Mesopotamia. They had agriculture, weaving, metallurgy, trade, architecture, and even writing or proto-writing, because the word for scribe is also borrowed. So the Proto-Euphrateans weren't primitive villagers. They were civilized. They had complex society. They had specialized occupations. They had monumental architecture. And all of this existed before Sumerian became the dominant language in the region. probably sometime in the 4th millennium BCE. Who were the Proto-Euphratians? Where did they come from? How long had they been in Mesopotamia? The linguistic evidence suggests they were there first, that they were the Ubaidians, the early settlers who built the first temples at Eridu, who developed irrigation agriculture, who created the foundation upon which later Sumerian culture built. But if the Proto-Euphratians were the Ubaidians, and the Ubaid culture stretches from 6,500 to 3,800 BCE, nearly 3,000 years, then that's a very long time for a single language and culture to remain dominant. Most linguistic cultures don't remain stable for 3 millennia. Languages change, evolve, split into dialects, get replaced by other languages. For Proto-Euphratian to remain the technical vocabulary source for so long suggests either remarkable cultural continuity or, alternatively, that Proto-Euphratian itself represents not a single language but a family of related languages or dialects, each phase of Ubaid culture speaking a slightly different version, but all sharing the core technical vocabulary that would later be borrowed into Sumerian. This could align with the 7 civilizations hypothesis. Each phase would have its own dialect of Proto-Euphratian, its own cultural characteristics, its own ceramic styles and architectural forms, but all would be part of a broader linguistic and cultural family. The Sumerian language, when it arrived or developed in the region, encountered this Proto-Euphratian language family and borrowed extensively from it, taking the entire technical vocabulary of civilization because the Proto-Euphratians had developed that vocabulary over thousands of years of lived experience with agriculture, craft production, and urban living. Later, as Sumerian became the language of writing and administration, Proto-Euphratian faded, eventually disappearing entirely, leaving only traces in the Sumerian vocabulary and perhaps in some geographical names that seem neither Sumerian nor Semitic. But before it disappeared, Proto-Euphratian had served as the language of civilization for perhaps 3,000 years, the language in which knowledge was transmitted, in which religious texts were recited, in which craft techniques were taught, in which astronomical observations were recorded orally. This linguistic layering, Sumerian overlying Proto-Euphratian, Akkadian, later overlying Sumerian, gives us a chronological framework. The Proto-Euphratian phase would correspond to the Ubaid period, roughly 6,500 to 3,800 BCE. The early Sumerian phase would correspond to the Uruk period, roughly 4,000 to 3,100 BCE, when Sumerian was becoming dominant but still coexisting with Proto-Euphratian, still borrowing vocabulary. The classical Sumerian phase would correspond to the early dynastic period, roughly 3000 to 2350 BCE, when Sumerian was fully dominant, when writing was developed to record Sumerian, when the great city-states flourished. And then the Akkadian phase, from 2350 BCE onward, when Semitic languages began to dominate politically, though Sumerian remained the language of religion and learning for another 1,000 years. Each linguistic phase corresponds to a phase of political and cultural development. Language shift reflects social change, population movement, political power, and if we track these shifts carefully, we can reconstruct the sequence of cultural horizons, the succession of peoples and traditions that built Mesopotamian civilization layer by layer over thousands of years. The 7 civilizations in this framework would represent 7 linguistic and cultural horizons within the long Proto-Euphratian phase, 7 subdivisions of the Ubaid period that might not be visible in the pottery sequences, but that were significant enough to be remembered in oral tradition, eventually recorded in the Sumerian king list as 7 antediluvian epochs, each with its own character, its own center, its own contribution to the accumulated knowledge base. We should also consider the role of religion and cosmology in preserving and transmitting this knowledge. The temples of Mesopotamia weren't just places of worship, they were economic centers, administrative centers, libraries, schools, and observatories. The priesthood wasn't just a religious class, they were the intellectual elite, the scribes, the astronomers, the mathematicians, the keepers of tradition. In early periods before writing, the priests would have been the oral historians, the ones who memorized the king lists and genealogies, the ones who knew the stories of the gods and the history of the cities, the ones who calculated the calendar and predicted the seasons. This knowledge was power. It gave the priesthood authority, influence, essential social function. And it gave them strong motivation to preserve the knowledge accurately, to transmit it carefully from generation to generation, because if the tradition was broken, if the knowledge was lost, their authority would be undermined. So we should expect that the priestly traditions would preserve some real historical memory, even if that memory became distorted and mythologized over millennia. The antediluvian section of the king list might represent the priest's honest attempt to chronicle the history of their institution, the succession of temple centers and priestly dynasties stretching back into the deep past. When they said kingship descended from heaven first at Eridu, they were saying that the priestly tradition, the institution of the temple, began at Eridu. When they listed the succession of centers, Eridu, Bad Tibera, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, they were chronicling the movement of priestly authority from one center to another over long periods of time. And when they assigned enormous reign lengths to the antediluvian kings, they were encoding the vast spans of time involved, the millennia over which this tradition developed. From this perspective, the king list is priestly history, an institutional chronicle of the temple tradition from its origins in the Neolithic to its classical form in the 3rd millennium BCE. It's not political history in the modern sense. It's not a chronicle of secular rulers and their conquests. It's a chronicle of sacred history, of how the relationship between humans and gods developed, of how the institution that mediated that relationship, the temple, evolved over time. And that institution, the temple, is indeed one of the most conservative elements of Mesopotamian culture. Temple plans remained remarkably stable for thousands of years. The basic form established at Eridu in the Ubaid period, a rectangular cella with an altar and offering table, remained the canonical form all the way down to the Neo-Babylonian period, 3,000 years later. The rituals performed in the temples, the daily offerings of food and drink to the gods, the great seasonal festivals, these too show remarkable continuity over millennia. The priests were conservative by nature, preserving ancient practices, resisting innovation, maintaining tradition. If any institution could preserve accurate memory over thousands of years, it would be the priesthood, with their emphasis on tradition, their training in memorization, their institutional continuity, and their written archives once writing was developed. So when the king list tells us that the temple tradition stretches back into deep time, that it has gone through multiple phases represented by different centers and different priestly dynasties, that it has survived catastrophes including the Great Flood, we should take this seriously as institutional memory, as the priesthood's own account of its history. This brings us back to the fundamental question: how should we interpret the Sumerian king list's antediluvian section? As pure mythology created to give antiquity to political institutions? As astronomical text encoding long celestial cycles? As institutional history of the priestly tradition? As compressed chronicle of 7 cultural phases in Mesopotamian prehistory? The answer might be all of the above. Ancient texts often work on multiple levels simultaneously. They can be myth and history and astronomy and theology all at once. The Mesopotamians didn't think in our categories. They didn't separate religion from politics, from science, from history. It was all interconnected, all part of a single cosmological whole. A text about kings could also be about gods. A chronicle of earthly events could mirror celestial cycles. History could be theology. Myth could preserve actual memory. So the king list might simultaneously be recording political history, astronomical observations, priestly succession, and cultural memory of prehistoric phases of civilization. All these interpretations might be true in different ways, emphasizing different aspects of a complex multi-layered text. The task for modern scholars is not to choose one interpretation and reject the others, but to understand how all these levels work together, how the text operates as a sophisticated encoding of multiple kinds of information, designed to be read on multiple levels by initiated readers who understood the symbolic system, the numerical codes, the theological implications, and the historical references all at once. Unfortunately, we're not initiated readers. We're outsiders trying to decode a symbolic system we don't fully understand, reading texts in a dead language recording a vanished worldview. We can analyze the mathematics, excavate the archaeological sites, translate the words, but we can't fully recover the mindset, the cultural context, the web of associations and meanings that would have been obvious to an ancient Mesopotamian, but that we have to painstakingly reconstruct through comparison of texts and archaeological correlation and analysis of symbolic patterns. This is why interpretations of ancient texts remain contested, why scholars continue to debate what these texts mean, why new theories keep emerging as new evidence is discovered or new analytical approaches are developed. The Seven Civilizations hypothesis is one such theory, an attempt to decode the King list by combining archaeological evidence of cultural phases in the Ubaid period with linguistic evidence of Proto-Euphratean substrate, with geological evidence of environmental change, with astronomical analysis of the numerical patterns in the rain lengths. It's speculative, certainly. It goes beyond what can be proven definitively from the available evidence. But it's grounded in real data, in genuine puzzles, in anomalies that need explanation. And it offers a framework for understanding the deep past of Mesopotamia that takes seriously both the archaeological record and the textual testimony of the Mesopotamians themselves. Whether the Seven Civilizations hypothesis is ultimately validated by future discoveries or disproven by new evidence, it serves a useful function in pushing us to think more deeply about cultural memory, about how knowledge is preserved and transmitted across catastrophes, about what kinds of information might be encoded in myths and ancient chronicles, about the relationship between oral tradition and historical accuracy. It reminds us that the people we study weren't simpler than us or less intelligent. They were fully human, with the same cognitive capacities we have, the same ability to observe and remember and reason and create. If they told us their civilization stretched back into deep time, if they said they remembered 7 epochs before the classical period, if they claimed to have knowledge passed down from the time before the flood, we should at least consider that these claims might contain some truth, however distorted by millennia of transmission. The past is accessible to us only through fragments, through broken pottery and ruined buildings, and texts in dead languages and oral traditions, written down centuries after the events they describe. We do our best to reconstruct what happened, but we're always working with incomplete information, always making inferences, always building interpretive frameworks that go beyond the bare facts. The Seven Civilizations hypothesis is one such framework, an attempt to make sense of the Sumerian evidence by proposing that civilization in Mesopotamia developed through multiple phases over thousands of years, each phase building on its predecessors, each contributing to the final flowering we call Sumer. Is it true? We don't know, but it's plausible. It fits the evidence. And it reminds us that the story of human civilization is longer and more complex than we once thought, stretching back not just to 3000 BCE, but potentially to 8000 BCE or even earlier, into the deep time when humans first began the long, difficult transition from mobile foraging to settled agriculture, from small villages to great cities, from oral tradition to written history. As we continue to excavate sites in Mesopotamia and the surrounding regions, as we translate more of the hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets that remain unstudied in museum collections, as we apply new techniques like satellite archaeology and environmental reconstruction and genetic analysis to the ancient past, we're likely to discover more evidence bearing on these questions. The lowest levels of tells remain mostly unexplored. The submerged coastlines of the Persian Gulf have barely been surveyed. The vast majority of Sumerian tablets have never been fully translated and studied. Each year brings new discoveries, new insights, new reasons to reconsider old interpretations. The 7 civilizations might eventually be confirmed, or the number might be revised to 6 or 8 or 10. The antediluvian section of the King list might turn out to encode even more information than we currently suspect, or it might prove to be more mythological and less historical than the hypothesis suggests. But regardless of how this specific theory fares, the broader project continues. The effort to understand the deep past, to recover the history of the earliest civilizations, to honor the memory of the people who began the long process of cultural development that led to the world we live in today. They deserve to be remembered. Their struggles, their innovations, their achievements, their failures, all of it is part of our heritage, part of the story of how humanity learned to live in cities, to write, to calculate, to organize, to create art and literature and law. The Sumerians and their predecessors built the foundation. Everything that came after, all the subsequent civilizations of Mesopotamia, Egypt, Greece, Rome, the Islamic Golden Age, the Renaissance, the modern world, all of it built on that foundation, on the innovations first developed in southern Mesopotamia between 8000 and 3000 BCE. And if we're right that there were 7 attempts before success, 7 civilizations that rose and fell before classical Sumer emerged, then the story is even more inspiring. It means humans didn't give up. After each catastrophe, after each collapse, after each failure, the survivors rebuilt. They tried again. They learned from their mistakes. They improved their techniques. They accumulated knowledge. And eventually, after thousands of years of persistence, they succeeded in creating a civilization that could last, that could grow, that could write down its knowledge and pass it to future generations, including to us, who read their texts 5,000 years later and are still trying to understand what they were telling us. In a sense, we're the 8th civilization, the latest in a long line of human societies stretching back into deep time, each building on the knowledge of its predecessors, each facing its own challenges and crises, each contributing to the ongoing project of human civilization. We like to think of ourselves as unprecedented, as unique, as the first people to achieve our level of sophistication. But we're not the first, we're the latest. We're the inheritors of a tradition stretching back thousands of years, a tradition of innovation and adaptation and resilience in the face of challenges. The Sumerians knew this. That's why they preserved the memory of the antediluvian epochs. That's why they wrote down the king list with its chronicle stretching back into mythic time. They knew they stood on the shoulders of giants, of predecessors who had paved the way, who had done the hard work of innovation and experimentation, who had paid the price of failure so that Sumer could succeed. We should remember this too. We're not starting from scratch. We're building on the accumulated wisdom of thousands of generations, on knowledge painfully won through trial and error, on institutions and technologies and cultural forms refined over millennia. And when we face our own challenges, our own potential collapses, our own environmental and social crises, we should remember the lesson of the 7 civilizations. Failure is not final. Collapse is not the end. As long as some knowledge survives, as long as some people persist, recovery is possible. Humanity has done it before. We've rebuilt after catastrophes. We've emerged from dark ages. We've recovered lost knowledge and moved forward. We can do it again if we need to. That's the ultimate message of the Sumerian king list. The encouragement across 5,000 years. Persist, rebuild, remember, and move forward. The archaeological evidence becomes even more compelling when we examine the material culture in detail, when we look at the objects themselves, the pottery, the tools, the architecture, the artworks that survived in the ground for thousands of years. Each artifact tells a story, provides a clue about the people who made it and used it. And when we analyze the artifacts from the Ubaid period, from the long span between 6,500 and 3,800 BCE, we see clear evidence of cultural change over time, of distinct phases that might correspond to the 7 civilizations encoded in the king list. The pottery sequence is particularly revealing. Archaeologists divide the Ubaid period into multiple phases based on changes in ceramic styles. Ubaid 0, the earliest phase, appears only at a few sites in northern Mesopotamia, around 6,500 BCE. The pottery is distinctive, painted with dark geometric designs on a light background, technically accomplished despite being handmade without the potter's wheel. Ubaid 1 and 2 from roughly 6,200 to 5,400 BCE show the culture spreading southward, appearing at sites like Eridu and Tel El Oeli. The pottery becomes slightly more sophisticated, the designs more complex, the forms more varied. This southward expansion might represent the first civilization in our sequence, the initial colonization of southern Mesopotamia by farming peoples bringing with them the knowledge and techniques developed in the north. Ubaid III, from about 5400 to 4800 BCE, is when the culture really takes off in the south. This is when Eridu becomes a major center, when the first substantial temples are built, when irrigation agriculture expands dramatically. The pottery from this phase is beautiful, with flowing painted designs of scorpions, birds, and geometric patterns. The paint applied with remarkable precision, the forms elegant and sophisticated. This might be the second civilization, the consolidation phase, when what had been scattered farming villages began to coalesce into something more complex, when temple building became central to community identity, when surplus production allowed for craft specialization. Ubaid IV, from roughly 4800 to 4200 BCE, shows further development. Sites become larger, settlements more numerous, trade networks more extensive. New artifact types appear, specialized tools, religious objects, prestige goods that suggest increasing social hierarchy. The pottery becomes even more refined, with some vessels so thin-walled and delicate that they must have been purely ceremonial, too fragile for everyday use. This investment in craft production for non-utilitarian purposes indicates surplus, leisure time, aesthetic sensibility, all markers of cultural sophistication. This could be the third civilization, the phase when social complexity really accelerated, when elite classes emerged who could command the labor of others and commission beautiful objects to display their status and piety. The final Ubaid phase, sometimes called Ubaid 4b or Late Ubaid, from about 4200 to 3800 BCE, shows maximum extent and influence. Ubaid pottery appears at sites from the Taurus Mountains in Turkey to the Persian Gulf, from western Iran to the Mediterranean coast. This wasn't a political empire with a central authority controlling distant provinces. It was a shared cultural horizon, a network of communities connected by trade, kinship, religion, and common material culture. They all made similar pottery, built similar temples, practiced similar burial customs, worshipped similar gods. This widespread cultural unity might represent the fourth, fifth, and sixth civilizations in our sequence, distinct phases within this final Ubaid horizon that archaeology hasn't yet fully resolved, because the material culture remains fairly stable across these centuries. But subtle changes in settlement patterns, in temple architecture, in the distribution of prestige goods might mark significant social and political transitions that the ancient Mesopotamians remembered as distinct epochs. And then the Ubaid culture ends fairly abruptly around 3800 BCE. There's a cultural break. The next phase, the Uruk period, shows different pottery styles and different settlement patterns, different architectural forms. Something changed. The consensus among archaeologists is that this represents not a collapse and abandonment, but a transformation, the Ubaid culture evolving into something new. But transformation can still be traumatic. Old social structures might have broken down. Old centers might have lost prominence while new ones rose. Old families might have lost power while new elites emerged. From the perspective of people living through this transition, it might have felt like the end of an age, the collapse of the old order, the advent of something new and uncertain. This transition from Ubaid to Uruk, from roughly 3800 to 3500 BCE, might be the flood of the Sumerian tradition. Not a literal inundation, but a metaphorical deluge, a time of upheaval and change when the old world ended and a new world began. And the civilization that emerged from this upheaval, the Uruk culture, would be the seventh civilization, the one that developed writing, that built the first true cities, that created the institutional structures of classical Sumer. This reading of the archaeological sequence aligns remarkably well with the King List's division of history into antediluvian and post-diluvian epochs, with 7 pre-flood phases and then a new beginning. It suggests that the ancient Mesopotamians preserved an accurate memory of their own cultural development, encoding it in the mythic narrative of the king list, even though they lack the technical vocabulary to describe it the way we do with our pottery phases and carbon dates and stratigraphic analysis. They saw the pattern. They recognized that their civilization had gone through multiple distinct phases. They remembered that there had been catastrophes and transitions, and they recorded this knowledge in the form available to them, as a king list with mythic rulers and enormous reign lengths, as a chronicle that operated on both historical and theological levels simultaneously. Modern archaeology confirms the basic pattern they described. The details are different. There weren't individual kings ruling for 30,000 years, but there were long cultural epochs, distinct phases of development, major transitions that felt like the end of one world and the beginning of another. The substance of their memory was accurate, even if the form was mythological. Let's push deeper into the material evidence, looking at specific artifacts and what they tell us about cultural development and knowledge transmission. One of the most striking aspects of Ubaid culture is the sophistication of their pottery, especially in the earlier phases. These people were master ceramicists. They understood clay composition, firing temperatures, pigment chemistry. They could control the firing process to achieve specific colors and surface finishes. They could paint intricate designs with steady hands and sure brushes. Where did this knowledge come from? Pottery making is a complex technology. You need to select the right clay, temper it with the right additives to prevent cracking, shape it properly, dry it carefully, fire it at the right temperature for the right duration. Each step requires specific knowledge gained through experimentation and experience. The earliest pottery in Mesopotamia, from sites like Jarmo in the north around 7000 BCE, is crude, thick-walled, poorly fired, undecorated. It takes the form of simple bowls and jars. This is experimental pottery, people figuring out the basics. But by the time of Ubaid III, around 5000 BCE, the pottery is sophisticated, thin-walled, well-fired, beautifully decorated. 2,000 years of development separate these two stages. 2,000 years of potters passing knowledge to their apprentices, each generation adding refinements, discovering new techniques, improving the craft. This is the kind of long-term cultural transmission we need to explain the sophisticated material culture we see in classical Sumer. It didn't appear overnight. It developed over millennia through slow accumulation of knowledge and technique. The same pattern appears in architecture. The earliest houses in Mesopotamia are simple rectangular structures made of mud brick or bundled reeds, single rooms with minimal internal features. By the Ubaid period, we see complex multi-room structures, carefully planned layouts, sophisticated construction techniques, including the use of fired brick for foundations to prevent water damage, bitumen for waterproofing, and plaster for interior surfaces. The temples show even more sophistication, with precise orientation, symmetrical plans, elaborately decorated facades, and specialized internal features like altars, offering tables and storage rooms for cult equipment. This architectural knowledge didn't come from nowhere. It developed through generations of builders, each one learning from their predecessors, each one contributing their own innovations, slowly refining the techniques of mud brick construction, plaster application, and roof support. The canonical temple plan that appears at Eridu in its earliest levels might seem to spring fully formed from the ground, but it represents the culmination of centuries of experimentation, the final form of a long developmental sequence whose earlier stages might have left no traces, or might be buried in unexcavated sites, or might have been constructed in perishable materials that didn't survive. When archaeologists find a sophisticated temple in the earliest occupation layer of a site, it doesn't mean that sophistication appeared suddenly. It means the development happened somewhere else, and we're seeing the results of a tradition that was already mature when it arrived at that particular location. This pattern repeats across multiple technologies. Metallurgy, the working of copper and later bronze, appears in Mesopotamia, already fairly sophisticated. The earliest copper objects from the Ubaid period include not just simple hammered items but cast objects, implying knowledge of smelting, alloying, and mold making. These are not beginner techniques. They require specific knowledge of ore processing, temperature control, and metal properties. Where was this knowledge developed? Probably in the copper-producing regions to the north and east, in Anatolia and Iran, where ore was available and where centuries of experimentation had perfected the techniques. When these techniques arrived in Mesopotamia, they came as a complete package. Craftspeople who already knew what they were doing, practicing their trade in Mesopotamian cities, training local apprentices, passing on the knowledge. Each technology has a similar story. Weaving, a complex process requiring understanding of fiber preparation, spinning, loom construction and pattern creation, appears in the archaeological record already sophisticated. Stoneworking, the production of beads, seals and vessels from hard stones like carnelian, lapis lazuli and alabaster, requires specialized knowledge of stone properties, cutting techniques and polishing methods. Wherever we look, we see mature technologies suggesting long developmental sequences that occurred outside our view, in earlier periods or in other regions or in ways that left minimal archaeological traces. This brings us to one of the central puzzles of Mesopotamian archaeology, the apparent lack of developmental sequences for many technologies. We see the finished product but not the learning curve. We see mature techniques but not the experimental phase. This has led to various explanatory hypotheses. One is that the development occurred in regions that are now underwater, submerged by post-glacial sea level rise. Another is that development occurred in the northern mountains where conditions for preservation are poor and where archaeological work has been less intensive. A third is that early experiments were done in perishable materials that didn't survive, and we only see the technology once it was applied to durable materials like clay and stone. All these factors probably contributed. But there's another possibility that aligns with the Seven Civilizations hypothesis. The developmental sequences did occur in southern Mesopotamia, but they occurred over such long time periods, spanning multiple cultural phases, that continuity was broken by collapses, and the knowledge had to be partially relearned multiple times. Each civilization in the sequence would have pushed certain technologies forward. The first phase, the initial Ubaid colonization, brought basic farming and pottery. The second phase added irrigation and temple building. The third phase developed metallurgy and specialized craft production. The fourth phase expanded trade networks and prestige good production. The fifth phase developed social hierarchy and administrative systems. The sixth phase refined astronomical knowledge and mathematical systems. And the seventh phase, the Uruk period, integrated all this accumulated knowledge and added the final crucial innovation, writing. Each phase didn't start from scratch. Each inherited the knowledge base from the previous phases, but each also faced its own challenges, its own collapses, its own periods of disruption when knowledge could be lost or degraded. The overall trend was upward, towards greater sophistication, but the path was not smooth. It zigzagged, advanced and retreated, made great leaps in some areas while forgetting techniques in others. This messy nonlinear pattern of cultural development is actually more realistic than the simple story of steady progress. Real cultural change is messy. Technologies are invented, forgotten, rediscovered. Techniques are lost when the old master dies without apprentices. Knowledge is preserved in some communities while being lost in others. Trade networks break down and reform. Centers of innovation shift from one region to another. Political upheavals disrupt craft production. Environmental disasters destroy infrastructure and scatter populations. Through all this chaos and change, somehow, knowledge accumulates. Somehow, the trend remains upward over long enough time periods. Somehow, by 3000 BCE, Mesopotamian civilization has developed all the key technologies: agriculture, irrigation, metallurgy, pottery, weaving, architecture, mathematics, astronomy, writing, administration, law. The question is not whether this development occurred. The archaeological record proves that it did. The question is how long it took and through what sequence of stages. The Seven Civilizations hypothesis proposes that it took about 5,500 years, from roughly 6,500 BCE to 3,000 BCE, proceeding through 7 distinct cultural phases, each contributing to the accumulated knowledge base, each ending in some form of collapse or transition, each giving way to the next phase which built on what came before. This timescale is reasonable. 5,500 years is enough time for multiple cycles of rise and fall, enough for several generations of technological development in each phase, enough for knowledge to accumulate even through periods of disruption. And it aligns with what we see in the archaeological record. The Ubaid sequence showing multiple phases of development over nearly 3 millennia, followed by the Uruk transition leading into classical Sumer. The numbers work. The archaeology supports it. The textual evidence from the king list provides a framework for interpretation. The linguistic evidence shows language succession and cultural layering. The geological evidence demonstrates environmental changes that could have driven collapses and transitions. All these different lines of evidence point in the same direction, toward a long, complex, multi-phase development of Mesopotamian civilization, a development that the ancient Mesopotamians themselves remembered and chronicled in their own way, encoding it in the mythic narrative of antediluvian kings and post-diluvian renewal. We can debate the details, the exact number of phases, the precise timing of transitions, the specific causes of collapses, but the basic pattern seems solid. Civilization in Mesopotamia emerged through a long, slow, interrupted process of cultural development spanning thousands of years and multiple distinct phases. Sumer was the culmination, not the beginning. The seventh civilization, not the first. There's another layer to explore, the evidence from burial practices and what they tell us about cultural continuity and change. The dead, after all, don't lie. Or rather, they lie in the ground, but their graves tell truth about beliefs, values, social structures, and cultural connections. Mesopotamian burial practices changed over time in ways that might reflect the cultural transitions we're tracking. In the earliest Ubaid phases, burials are relatively simple. Bodies are placed in graves with few goods, perhaps a pot or two, maybe a few beads. The grave locations vary, sometimes under house floors, sometimes in cemeteries, sometimes apparently random. There's little evidence of social differentiation in burial. Everyone gets roughly the same treatment regardless of status. This suggests relatively egalitarian societies, communities where differences in wealth and power were minimal, where everyone shared similar material conditions. But as the Ubaid period progresses, burials become more elaborate and more differentiated. Some graves contain many goods, fine pottery, copper objects, imported stones, jewelry. These are elite burials, people of high status being sent to the afterlife with markers of their wealth and power. Other graves remain simple, just a body and maybe one pot. The social hierarchy visible in settlement patterns and temple architecture now appears in death as well. Society is stratified. Elites have emerged who command resources, who can afford elaborate burials, who can pass status to their children, who inherit their wealth and position. This is a major social transition, from egalitarian village society to hierarchical society with permanent class distinctions. This transition didn't happen overnight. It developed over centuries as some families accumulated more surplus, gained more influence over temple and community decisions, established themselves as hereditary elite. The burial evidence also shows cultural continuity and discontinuity. During stable periods, burial practices remain consistent across generations, the same grave types, the same positioning of bodies, the same categories of grave goods. But at transition points, burial practices change. Bodies are oriented differently. Grave goods change in type and quantity. Cemetery locations shift. New forms of burial appear. These changes signal cultural disruption, new populations arriving or old populations adopting new ideas and practices. If we track these changes carefully, we see several points of discontinuity that might correspond to the transitions between the 7 civilizations. One major change occurs around 4200 BCE at the transition from Middle to Late Ubaid. Burial practices shift, new ceramic styles appear, settlement patterns change, something significant happened. Another change occurs around 3800 BCE at the end of the Ubaid period. The transition to Uruk brings new burial forms, new grave goods, new ways of treating the dead. Each of these transitions might mark the end of one civilization and the beginning of the next in our sequence. Not catastrophic collapses that killed everyone and erased all memory, but significant enough disruptions that they were remembered as epochal changes, as the end of ages. The people living through these transitions would have experienced them as times of upheaval, when old certainties failed, when traditional ways no longer worked, when new leaders emerged with new ideas, when the world seemed to be transforming. These memories would be preserved in oral tradition, eventually written down as accounts of the end of antediluvian epochs and the beginning of new ones, as stories of floods and catastrophes and divine interventions that destroyed the old world and created the new. The trade networks that connected Mesopotamian cities to distant regions provide another crucial line of evidence for understanding cultural development and knowledge transmission. Trade isn't just about moving goods from one place to another. It's about moving ideas, technologies, and cultural practices. It's about creating connections between distant peoples, allowing innovations developed in one region to spread to others, facilitating the kind of cultural exchange that drives civilization forward. The archaeological evidence for long-distance trade in Mesopotamia stretches back deep into the Ubaid period, with luxury goods from distant sources appearing in elite burials and temple deposits. Lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, carnelian from India or Iran, obsidian from Anatolia, copper from the Taurus Mountains, timber from Lebanon. These materials had to be obtained through trade networks spanning hundreds or even thousands of miles. Such networks don't emerge overnight. They require trust between trading partners, reliable routes, systems for exchange, protection for merchants, and demand for exotic goods. The presence of these materials in Ubaid sites as early as 5500 BCE suggests that trade networks were already well established by that time, which means they must have been developing for centuries before, probably stretching back into the 7th millennium BCE. Let's think about what it takes to trade lapis lazuli from Afghanistan to southern Iraq. First, someone in Afghanistan has to mine the stone, recognize its value, and prepare it for transport. Then it has to move from mine to market, probably through multiple intermediaries, each one adding value and taking a cut. From Afghanistan, it might go to Iran, then to the Zagros foothills, then down to the Mesopotamian plain. At each stage, different people speaking different languages have to negotiate exchange, establish prices, transfer goods. This requires some form of common value system, some way to determine how much lapis is worth compared to grain or copper or pottery. It requires trust that the other party will deliver what they promise. It requires knowledge of routes, of safe passage, of seasonal timing to avoid floods or snowstorms or other hazards. All of this represents sophisticated commercial and social organization, and it was operating in the 6th millennium BCE, during the early Ubaid period, which we're proposing might be the first or second civilization in our sequence. So even our first civilization wasn't primitive. It was already engaged in complex trade networks, already valued exotic goods, already had the social organization to support long-distance commerce. This sophistication has to come from somewhere. It suggests either that development was more rapid than we usually assume, or more likely that the development started even earlier, in periods before the Ubaid in the 7th or 8th millennium BCE, in times we usually think of as Neolithic or pre-civilization. Perhaps civilization is much older than we think, and what we call the first civilization is actually the 7th iteration, the latest version of a much older pattern of complex social organization. The trade goods themselves tell fascinating stories. Obsidian, volcanic glass prized for making sharp cutting tools, has been geochemically sourced to specific volcanic outcrops in eastern Anatolia. When archaeologists find obsidian in Mesopotamian sites, they can analyze its chemical composition and determine exactly which volcano it came from. This allows them to map trade routes, to see which sources were preferred at which times, to track changes in trade patterns over centuries and millennia. What they find is that trade routes remained remarkably stable over long periods, suggesting institutional continuity, Consistent demand established relationships between producing and consuming regions. But there are also shifts, periods when one source suddenly becomes more popular while another declines, suggesting political changes, route disruptions, or shifts in trading partnerships. These shifts might correlate with our civilizational phases. Each civilization might have had a slightly different trade networks, different preferred sources, different trading partners. The transition from one civilization to the next might have involved reorganization of trade, new elites establishing new connections, old networks breaking down while new ones formed. If we could map these patterns precisely, correlate trade network changes with pottery phases and architectural transitions and burial practice shifts, we might be able to identify the boundaries between our 7 civilizations, to see exactly when each phase ended and the next began. Unfortunately, the chronological resolution isn't quite fine enough yet. We can see the broad patterns but not the precise transitions. More excavation, more analysis, more precise dating will eventually give us better resolution, allowing us to test these hypotheses more rigorously. Particularly intriguing is the evidence for maritime trade. The Persian Gulf in the Ubaid period was a major trade route, connecting southern Mesopotamia to the Arabian coast, to Dilmun, Bahrain, to Magan, Oman, and ultimately to the Indus Valley. Mesopotamian pottery appears at sites along the Arabian coast. Arabian and Iranian pottery appears in Mesopotamia. Marine shells, pearl, carnelian, copper, these materials flowed along maritime routes. This implies ships, sailors, navigation knowledge, understanding of winds and currents and seasonal patterns. Maritime navigation is sophisticated technology. You need to build seaworthy vessels, which requires knowledge of hull construction, waterproofing, rigging, and sailmaking. You need to navigate, which requires celestial observation for direction, understanding of landmarks and currents, knowledge of safe harbors and dangerous reefs. You need to time your voyages to favorable seasons, avoiding storms and unfavorable winds. All of this is complex knowledge that must be learned and transmitted across generations. The presence of maritime trade in the Ubaid period suggests this knowledge was already well developed by 5000 BCE, which again pushes the developmental timeline back further, implying earlier phases of learning and experimentation that we can't yet document archaeologically. Perhaps our first civilization was already a maritime culture, already trading by sea, building on knowledge developed in even earlier periods when rising sea levels were drowning coastal settlements and forcing peoples to become adept at boat building and coastal navigation out of sheer necessity. The cultural exchange facilitated by trade wasn't just material. Ideas travelled along trade routes. Religious concepts, mythological narratives, artistic styles, technological innovations, all of these could spread from one culture to another through contact between traders, through intermarriage between trading communities, through the movement of specialist craftspeople seeking employment in distant cities. We can track some of these cultural flows through the archaeological record. Certain pottery forms appear in multiple regions simultaneously, suggesting either direct trade of finished vessels or transfer of technical knowledge allowing local potters to copy foreign styles. Certain artistic motifs, like the rosette or the stepped triangle or the human figure with raised arms, appear across wide areas, suggesting shared symbolic systems or borrowing of meaningful images. Certain architectural forms, like the tripartite temple plan or the use of buttresses for wall decoration, spread across Mesopotamia and into adjacent regions, suggesting either migration of builders or transmission of architectural knowledge through some other mechanism. Each of these cultural flows represents human connection, people meeting, talking, sharing, learning from each other, and each connection is a potential pathway for the transmission of the deeper knowledge we're trying to track. The astronomical observations, the mathematical systems, the cosmological frameworks, the historical memories that would eventually be written down in texts like the Sumerian king list. One fascinating aspect of this cultural exchange is the apparent two-way flow between Mesopotamia and Egypt into the late 4th millennium BCE. At exactly the time when writing is being developed in Uruk, similar developments are occurring in Egypt. The Naqada III period in Egypt shows sudden appearance of sophisticated art, monumental architecture, administrative seals, and hieroglyphic writing, all emerging around 3200, 3000 BCE in a remarkably short time span. This has led to speculation about cultural contact between Mesopotamia and Egypt, about whether the idea of writing might have been transferred from one region to the other, sparking parallel but independent developments. The evidence is circumstantial but suggestive. Mesopotamian cylinder seals appear in Egypt in small numbers. Mesopotamian artistic motifs appear in Egyptian art. Architectural features characteristic of Mesopotamia appear in early Egyptian monuments. The contact was real. The question is how much influence flowed in each direction and whether the similarities in development are due to direct transfer of knowledge or to parallel evolution driven by similar social needs. What's undeniable is that both regions were developing complex state-level civilization at roughly the same time, using similar tools like writing and sealing to manage increasingly complex bureaucratic and economic systems. This synchronicity might be coincidence, or it might suggest some deeper connection, some shared source of knowledge or influence that affected both regions simultaneously. If we take seriously the possibility that both civilizations built on much older traditions, on accumulated knowledge spanning thousands of years, then perhaps they were both drawing on a common pool of human cultural achievement, a shared heritage of innovation stretching back into the post-glacial period when rising seas were drowning coastal settlements and forcing adaptive innovations in multiple regions around the Mediterranean and Near East. The flood in this reading wasn't just a Mesopotamian memory. It was a pan-regional trauma, remembered in Egypt, in Greece, in the Levant, in Anatolia, wherever coastal peoples faced the rising seas, and the civilizations that emerged in the 4th millennium BCE in Mesopotamia and Egypt and elsewhere were all inheritors of this shared experience, all building on knowledge developed during the long age of environmental upheaval. This brings us to a crucial methodological point about how we study ancient history. We can't rely solely on the archaeological record from one region. We need to look at the broader picture, at cultural developments across the entire Near East and beyond, looking for patterns, connections, parallel developments that might shed light on processes we can't fully document in any single region. The 7 civilizations hypothesis for Mesopotamia gains plausibility when we see similar patterns elsewhere, when we recognize that the model of multiple phases of cultural development, punctuated by collapses and renewals, isn't unique to Mesopotamia, but appears to be a general pattern of how civilization emerges. In Egypt, before the pharaohs, there were Naqada I, II, and III, distinct cultural phases over more than 1,000 years. In the Indus Valley, before Harappan civilization, there were early Harappan phases, pre-Harappan cultures, each building toward the final synthesis. In China, before the Shang dynasty, there were Longshan and Yangshao cultures, each contributing to the eventual emergence of Chinese civilization. Everywhere we look, we see the same pattern. Civilization doesn't appear suddenly. It emerges through long processes of cultural development, through multiple phases, each building on its predecessors. The specific number of phases varies by region and how we divide the sequence, but the general pattern is consistent. And if this pattern is general, if it's how civilization actually emerges, then the Mesopotamian case isn't exceptional. The 7 phases suggested by the king list interpretation are just the local version of a universal process. A process the ancient Mesopotamians understood and chronicled in their own way because that they were living through it, experiencing it, seeing the pattern unfold over generations and centuries. One fascinating aspect of Mesopotamian burial practices that becomes increasingly important in later Ubaid and Uruk periods is the burial of infants and children in jars or ceramic vessels. Hundreds of these jar burials have been discovered at sites across Mesopotamia. The practice seems to have specific ritual significance, not just a practical way to inter small bodies, but a deliberate choice with symbolic meaning. Some researchers interpret these jar burials as attempts to return the deceased child to the womb symbolically, the jar representing the womb, the burial or reincorporation of the child into the Earth Mother. Others see connections to beliefs about rebirth and reincarnation, the jar as a vessel not just for burial, but for transformation and renewal. The widespread adoption of this burial practice across many sites and over long time periods suggests shared religious beliefs, common cosmological ideas about death, the afterlife, and the relationship between humans and the divine. These beliefs must have been transmitted across generations, taught by priests and elders, maintained through ritual practice. They represent another form of cultural continuity, another thread connecting the different phases of Mesopotamian civilization. Even as political structures changed, even as new technologies were adopted, even as populations migrated and mixed, fundamental religious ideas persisted, providing continuity of worldview across centuries of material culture change. This is important because it suggests that cultural memory could indeed be preserved across the kinds of disruptions we're hypothesizing. Religious beliefs, expressed through ritual practices like burial customs, can be remarkably conservative, maintaining forms and ideas long after their original meanings have been forgotten or transformed. The jar burial practice that began in the Ubaid period continued into the Uruk period and beyond, lasting over a millennium with only minor variations. If burial practices could maintain such continuity, other forms of cultural knowledge, oral traditions, astronomical observations, historical chronicles, could also be preserved across the transitions between our 7 civilizations, carried forward by priestly lineages who saw themselves as guardians of sacred knowledge, responsible for maintaining the connection between present and past, between the human realm and the divine realm, between the ephemeral and the eternal. The modern study of ancient Mesopotamia continues to evolve as new technologies enable new forms of investigation and analysis. Satellite imagery allows archaeologists to identify previously unknown sites without ground surveys, detecting subtle variations in vegetation or soil that indicate buried structures. Tens of thousands of potential archaeological sites have been identified this way in Iraq, Syria, and surrounding regions, most never excavated, many probably containing important evidence about the periods we're discussing. Ground-penetrating radar and other geophysical survey techniques allow researchers to map buried remains without excavation, to see what lies beneath tells and ancient city mounds, to identify the extent and organization of settlements, to locate temples and palaces and workshops. This technology has revealed that many sites are much larger and more richly complex than surface remains suggest, that what appears to be a modest mound might actually be concealing a substantial ancient city whose ruins extend far underground. Genetic analysis of ancient human remains is beginning to shed light on population movements, migrations, and admixtures. By analyzing DNA from skeletons buried in different periods, researchers can track genetic continuity and change, can identify when new populations arrived in a region, can detect admixture between different groups. This helps answer questions about whether cultural changes visible in the archaeological record represent migration of new peoples or adoption of new practices by existing populations. So far, the genetic evidence from Mesopotamia suggests substantial continuity from the Neolithic through the Bronze Age, with the same basic population remaining in place even as material culture changed dramatically. This supports the idea that the phases we're tracking represent cultural evolution, rather than replacement, the same peoples transforming their own society over time, rather than being conquered or displaced by outsiders. This genetic continuity is crucial for understanding how knowledge could be preserved across the 7 civilizations we're proposing. If the same population remained in place throughout, then oral traditions, ritual practices, astronomical knowledge, all of these could be transmitted across the transitional periods, surviving even when material culture changed significantly. Isotopic analysis of ancient bones and teeth provides information about diet, about where people grew up versus where they died, about trade in food and other organic materials. By analyzing the ratio of different isotopes in bone collagen and tooth enamel, researchers can determine whether someone ate primarily grain or meat or fish, whether they consumed food grown locally or imported from elsewhere, whether they moved during their lifetime or remained in one place. This kind of analysis has revealed that even in early periods, some individuals were consuming exotic foods, drinking water from different sources, moving between regions, suggesting more mobility and more long-distance connection than we might expect for supposedly simple village societies. The evidence accumulates that Ubaid culture was sophisticated, complex, cosmopolitan, not the primitive beginning of civilization, but perhaps already the sixth or seventh iteration, already building on thousands of years of earlier development. The isotopic signatures also reveal periods of environmental stress, times when diet shifted toward less desirable foods, when water sources changed, when agricultural productivity declined. These stress periods might correlate with the transitions between our civilizational phases, the moments when environmental challenges overwhelmed social systems, triggering collapses or major reorganizations. By mapping these environmental fluctuations against the archaeological sequence, researchers are building a more complete picture of how climate and environment and human society interacted over millennia, how environmental changes drove social adaptations, how societies succeeded or failed based partly on their ability to respond to environmental challenges. This environmental dimension is crucial for understanding the seven civilizations hypothesis. Each phase would have faced its own environmental conditions, its own challenges and opportunities. The transitions between phases might have been triggered by environmental shifts, droughts or floods, or sea level changes that disrupted existing social systems and forced reorganization. Digital reconstruction and modeling allow researchers to virtually reconstruct ruined buildings, to visualize what ancient cities looked like, to test hypotheses about construction techniques and astronomical alignments. By creating detailed 3D models from archaeological data, researchers can explore ancient spaces, can understand sightlines and acoustic properties, can test whether temples were really aligned to celestial events or whether apparent alignments are coincidental. This technology has confirmed that many Mesopotamian temples were indeed astronomically aligned, with doorways oriented to sunrise on solstices or equinoxes, with internal features positioned to capture specific celestial phenomena. This confirms that astronomical knowledge was central to Mesopotamian religion and architecture from very early periods, supporting the hypothesis that astronomical observation and mathematical calculation were ancient traditions stretching back long before writing. The precision of these alignments, sometimes accurate to within a fraction of a degree, suggests careful observation and mathematical calculation, expertise that must have developed over generations of practice and refinement. When we find such precision in temples dating to 5000 BCE, we're seeing the culmination of perhaps centuries of astronomical observation and architectural experimentation. The knowledge didn't appear suddenly. It accumulated slowly through the patient work of many generations of priest astronomers, each one contributing observations, each one refining techniques, each one teaching apprentices who would carry the tradition forward. This is exactly the kind of long-term knowledge accumulation that the seven civilizations hypothesis proposes. Knowledge building across multiple cultural phases, surviving transitions and collapses, ultimately flowering in classical Sumer, but with roots stretching back thousands of years into the prehistoric past. Analysis of the hundreds of thousands of cuneiform tablets in museum collections continues to reveal new information about Mesopotamian culture, history, and thought. The vast majority of these tablets remain unpublished, unstudied, sitting in storage awaiting scholarly attention. Each year, new texts are translated and published, adding to our knowledge. Some are mundane administrative records of grain deliveries or worker assignments, but others are literary, historical, or scientific texts that shed light on Mesopotamian worldviews and knowledge systems. Recently translated astronomical texts have revealed sophisticated mathematical techniques for predicting planetary positions, methods that wouldn't be rediscovered in Europe until the Renaissance. Mathematical tablets have shown that Mesopotamian mathematicians understood concepts we associate with much later periods, including a form of calculus for calculating areas and volumes. Medical texts have demonstrated systematic observation of symptoms and rational approaches to diagnosis and treatment. Every new text adds depth to our understanding, and there are still hundreds of thousands waiting to be studied. Among these unstudied texts might be additional king lists, more flood narratives, other versions of creation myths, astronomical observation records, mathematical treatises, any of which might provide new evidence bearing on the questions we're exploring. The potential for discovery remains vast. We're still in the early stages of understanding Mesopotamian civilization, still scratching the surface of what the archaeological record can tell us. The seven civilizations hypothesis is based on evidence we have now, but future discoveries might confirm, refute, or require us to substantially modify the hypothesis. This is how scholarship progresses, through constant testing of hypotheses against new evidence, through revision and refinement of our understanding as our knowledge base grows. What seems speculative now might become accepted fact in 20 years if supporting evidence accumulates, or it might be disproven and abandoned. The process of investigation continues. So as we conclude this exploration into the deep past, into the seven civilizations that might have preceded classical Sumer, into the mysteries encoded in ancient texts and buried in ancient tells, let's remember that this isn't just an academic exercise. This is our history, the story of how we became who we are, the chronicle of the long, slow, difficult process by which humans created civilization. Every city we live in today owes something to Eridu, to Uruk, to Ur. Every written word traces back to the first Sumerian scribe pressing wedges into wet clay. Every mathematical calculation uses concepts first developed by Mesopotamian priest astronomers. Every calendar synchronizes with astronomical cycles first tracked in ancient temples. Every legal code builds on principles first established in Sumerian law. We are the inheritors of their legacy. And if that legacy stretches back not just to classical Sumer, but to 7 earlier attempts, 7 proto-civilizations that tried and failed but contributed to the final success, then our debt is even greater, and our responsibility to preserve and build upon that inheritance is even more profound. The deep past is not dead. It lives on in us, in our institutions, our knowledge, our ways of organizing society, and it calls to us still through ancient texts and ruined cities, asking us to remember, to understand, to honor those who came before. If you found this exploration into the deep mysteries of Sumerian history fascinating, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Share your thoughts in the comments about which aspects of this ancient civilization intrigue you most. And as always, thank you for joining me on this journey into the shadows of the past, into the time before history, into the realm where archaeology meets mythology and ancient testimony whispers of forgotten ages. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and never stop wondering what secrets the past still holds, waiting to be discovered.